Welcome to my channel. This is CAPT.BINOY Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Devgiri, Kozhikode, Kerala. We discussed the Poetics of Aristotle, and this is lecture number 6 in this series of lecture on the Poetics. And till now, we have discussed 16 chapters of the Poetics, and in this lecture, we are discussing chapters 17, 18, 19 and 20. So first let us look at chapter 17. Chapter 17 of the Poetics is titled Some Rules for the Tragic Poet. This chapter, Aristotle is instructing or just giving advice to the future poets. So he is just asking the future dramatists to do certain things. First thing he asks the tragic poets to do is to visualize the scenes. Tragic poets should visualize what is going to be on stage. And number 2, he asks them to carry out apt gestures for the speeches. There must be proper coordination between the words and gestures of the speakers. And number 3, he asks the tragic poet to plan a general outline for the story. So these are the most significant points we have to remember about chapter 17, some rules for the tragic poet. We can just explain it this way. Aristotle points out that visualizing the action is crucial for a poet in order to avoid gaps in logic or inconsistencies. All right, so this is the reason. So when we visualize, we can avoid gaps in logic or inconsistencies. And besides, he tells that rather than seeing the action in his head, Aristotle is asking the poets to work out the action before his eyes. And Aristotle also suggests that a poet construct a general outline and then fill in episodes and detail. Thus, a poet can work out a play's essence and then focus on the episodes that will support this essence and in effect create unity. So this is the gist of chapter 17. And now we move on to chapter 18. Chapter 18 is about, Aristotle gives more rules for the tragic poet, and it is titled Further Rules for the Tragic Poet. So chapter 17, we saw some rules, 3 instructions. Chapter 18, further rules for the tragic poet. And this chapter, Aristotle is just helping us understand the 4 kinds of tragedy. There are 4 kinds of tragedy, and he speaks to us in detail about 4 kinds of tragedy. Say, every tragedy contains 2 parts. Initial opening of the chapter 18, he tells that every tragedy contains 2 parts, complication and unraveling. Unraveling is denouement. So every tragedy has 2 parts. You better remember what you studied as a graduate student, the Freytagian pyramidical structure of tragedy. And here Aristotle says that every tragedy has 2 parts, complication and unraveling. The complication refers to everything from the beginning of the action to the turning point or climax, where bad fortune turns to good or good fortune turns to bad. The unraveling or denouement extends for the climax to the end and tracks the final transformation of a hero to good or bad fortune. And based on the very incidents on stage or in the play, he says that there can be 4 kinds of tragedy. Number 1, we have the complex tragedy. Number 2, we have the pathetic tragedy. And number 3, we have the ethical tragedy. And 4, the simple tragedy. And now let's understand what each of these 4 types of tragedy are. So complex tragedy depends entirely on reversals and recognition at the climax. So that's about the very action or the tragic effect. The pity and fear is caused through a dependence, a complete dependence on peripetia and anagnosis, or reversal and discovery. And pathetic tragedy is a kind of tragedy which is motivated by passion. So pathetic tragedy is also known as tragedy of suffering. Okay, it is tragedy motivated by passion, and there is so much of crying, weeping, pain, lamenting and all. And the third kind of tragedy is what is known as ethical tragedy. Ethical tragedy is also called tragedy of character. Ethical tragedy is also called tragedy of character because ethical tragedies or tragedies of character are motivated by morality or the moral element. And finally, we have the fourth kind of tragedy, that is simple tragedy. And the simple tragedy is the best kind of tragedy according to Aristotle, and he calls the simple tragedy spectacular tragedy. So the simple tragedy is of course the tragedy which has simple plot. So while discussing different types of plot, we saw that there are 2 types of plots, the complex plot and the simple plot. So simple plot is a plot in which we have no reversal or recognition, and Aristotle calls such type of tragedies spectacular tragedy. And now Aristotle also tells that a tragedy should not assume an epic structure. We know epic is of course narrative and it is very long, and Aristotle says that a tragedy should not assume an epic structure, shouldn't be so lengthy. And in the beginning he said that a tragedy should be confined to a single revolution of the sun 24 hours. And one plot, a tragedy must have one plot that creates unity of action in all that is required for tragic catharsis. If there is no unity of action, there is no cathartic effect. And we know that catharsis is of course purification of emotions, like through pity and fear the spectators are just purified, or the emotions of the spectators are purified. They just shed tears, they just cry. And we can say that Aristotle concludes his discussion of reversal and recognition by suggesting that a tragedy should not assume an epic structure involving many plots. A tragedy should have one plot that creates unity of action. That is what will ensure catharsis in a tragedy. And now we come to chapter 19 of the Poetics. Chapter 19 is titled Thought and Action, and obviously we understand that this chapter is about thought and action. So he is defining what is thought and what is diction. So according to Aristotle, thought includes all the effects that have to be produced by means of language. So we have characters, we have the action, the deeds, the activities of the characters, and so all the effect that have to be produced by means of language. And every character speaks, like we have Oedipus dialogue, we have Macbeth's words, we have Othello's words, and all that we hear is the result of the idea that passed to the mind of the character. So the thought includes all the effects that have to be produced by means of language. Like it means a character speaks, or rather the tragic poet is making the character to say something so that the spectators fear, the spectators have the feelings of pity, fear, anger, humor, etc. So all that. So the very feeling of pity, fear, anger, humor, etc. is occurring in the mind of the spectator through the language. And that is, language is the result of you speak something that is in your mind, and thought is what's in your mind. And of course thought is just causing all the different emotions of the spectators as well as the characters, right? And now we come to diction. What is diction? Simple and easy to understand. Diction is the expression of thought through speech. We have a lot of soliloquies, like we have Hamlet, to be or not to be. That's the question, whether it's nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Hamlet, right? Similarly, we have Macbeth. Okay, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. All right. So this is the thought of Hamlet on one side, thought of Macbeth on the other side. So what is diction? Diction is the expression of thought through speech. So whatever feelings Oedipus has, whatever feelings Hamlet has, whatever thoughts Macbeth has, the very fear, the worry, the anxiety, the suspicion, the kind of schizophrenic feelings, okay, all this is just expressed through speech. And what is diction? Diction is expression of thought through speech. And now we can just summarize that Aristotle in this chapter 19, moves on to diction, or the expression of thought through speech. Speech can be divided into a proof and refutation. Excitation of feelings, pity, fear, and anger, or the suggestion of importance. Indeed, action can be divided similarly by the difference between action and speech, and of course the difference between action and speech is that action can stand alone without exposition, while speech depends on the effect of the speech in order to gain a result. The speech in itself is action. So we have the words of the characters, and the words of the characters just cause, right, different emotions, and we can say that speech in itself is an action. And now let us just summarize this chapter 19. So here rather in chapter 17, 18 and 19, Aristotle begins with an important note on visualization. Then he just points out that such visualization inevitably leads to of course a successful plot. If we do not have visualization, there may be gaps in the sequence of the incidents, and there could be some kind of inconsistencies. And in order to avoid inconsistency, the tragic poet has to, of course, visualize what's happening. And now Aristotle again says that there are only two parts to a drama. That is, of course, the complication and denouement. To be more simple, the complication begins with an inciting incident. A trigger puts a chain of events in motion, and at some point the chain reaches a climax where the hero's fortunes must irreversibly turn from good to bad, or bad to good. Good to bad happens in tragedy, bad to good happens in comedy. And the denouement, or unraveling, is simply the end of this transformation that begins at the climax. So, for example, in Oedipus Rex, the complication sees us all the way through Oedipus discovering his own crimes, and from there the denouement takes us through his self-mutilation and redemption. Often then the climax takes place at the moment of key reversal or recognition in a tragedy. Without this reversal or recognition, the author must rely on, of course, some other form of invention in order to create a climax. either ethics or passion, as Aristotle says in his summary of the types of tragedy, or a purposeful simplicity to the drama. Now we come to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is titled Some Linguistic Definitions. Some linguistic definitions. So in this chapter, some linguistic definitions, Aristotle is just defining, of course, some literary terms, and he defines what a metaphor is. And he says that a metaphor is a transference. According to Aristotle, a metaphor is a transference that is, of course, linking two unlikely things. Say we say, my love is a red rose. We have two, in fact, objects. On one side we have the beloved or the lover. The other side we have the rose. And we have the very transference of the beloved to a rose. My love is a red rose. Okay, so linking two unlikely things is metaphor according to Aristotle. And in chapter 20 he talks in detail about the linguistic definitions. Like Aristotle classifies Greek words in an esoteric discussion of simple and compound terms, and the reader can sit through a majority of this analysis and focus instead on his definition of a few key literary terms. Okay, first is metaphor, or the use of transference to link two unlike things. Life-setting sun is an example. Life-setting sun, for instance, does not hedge or qualify its comparison with like or as. That would be a simile, or create primacy around one term, as in an analogy. Instead, a metaphor simply links two objects with the understanding that the reader will find the unity of concept that connects them. So having just defined a metaphor and having given enough examples to help the readers understand what a metaphor is, Aristotle just concludes that chapter 20, and with that we come to the end of lecture number 5 in this series of lectures on Aristotle's The Poetics. And in the next lecture, in fact this is lecture number 6, so we end the lecture number 6, and next lecture will be lecture number 7. And lecture number 7 we will be looking at chapters 21, 22, 23 and 24. So we will meet in the next lecture. Thanks a lot for listening. May God bless you all. Thank you.